Hi everyone. We're back now with the ancient Romans, and we need to talk about the rather bloody and chaotic transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. It's not going to be pretty. In our last lecture, I mentioned that Rome was doing spectacularly well by the 1st century BCE. They were conquering a tremendous amount of territory as a result of the Punic Wars. They had taken down the Greeks and the Macedonians. They were continuing to stretch across North Africa. They seemed like a juggernaut, really, an unstoppable force. And that was the case from the standpoint of an external power successfully challenging them. That there is no external power that really can check their success during this period. It's actually going to be internal problems that will lead to Rome beginning to stumble and then ultimately fall over time. Now, I mentioned in the previous video, for example, the rising number of slaves, how that is certainly a destabilizing force in their society over time as the number of slave rebellions begins to increase. Uprisings led by Eunice, for example, in Sicily in 135 BCE, or Spartacus in southern Italy in 73 BCE. This begins to really cause a lot of internal stress and problem for Roman governance, especially of the outlying regions, the far-flung areas of their empire. And then, of course, there's the land issue, the struggle of the orders between the wealthy, the haves, the patrician class, and the have-nots, the numerically superior plebeian class. Who gets all this land? Again, taking a look at, this is a map actually during the 2nd century CE, but it gives you an idea of a lot of the territory that Rome will eventually take over. What's happening to all these so-called public lands that are falling and coming under Roman domination? Now, historically speaking, there were two ways in which these public lands were dispensed of. Number one was some of this land was given as a retirement benefit, a pension, if you will, for former members of the Roman army. Thank you for serving Rome all these years. Here, you get 100 acres of land to support you and your family. The second way was that these public lands gained by warfare, would be made available at a reduced price, below market price, so that the poor or the plebeian class could have a chance to own land. Increasingly, though, that's not what's happening to this land. We're seeing that Roman senators, that patrician politicians, are beginning to amass a lot of this land to themselves, rather than it being made available to veterans, rather than it being made available to the poor as a leg up in Roman society. For this reason, we will see several plebeian politicians, the Gracchi brothers, first Tiberius and then later his brother Gaius Gracchus, beginning to complain publicly, beginning to campaign that something must be done to provide land to the poor and suffering in Rome. In 133 BCE, for example, Tiberius Gracchus, who was serving as tribune in the tribune of the plebes, suggested the so-called Agrarian Law. He wanted to put a cap or a limit of 640 acres of land for any one Roman family to be able to own. Anyone who owned in excess of 640 acres, the state would confiscate that land and redistribute it to the needy. Well, you can guess. There's many who oppose this, many wealthy, powerful, influential patrician politicians. This is a disaster from their standpoint. So they will work to get this agrarian law vetoed. It will never actually come into effect. And they're hoping that Tiberius will get the message, sit down and shut up. Only he doesn't. Tiberius doubles down. He will call for a special election to unseat his rival in the tribune of the plebes, Octavius. He will move forward with plans to set up family members to be in control of overseeing a land commission, to parcel out property to the poor, and finally, breaking completely with Roman tradition, he will run for another term as tribune and begin vetoing all laws coming before him, essentially bringing Roman politics to a standstill until this issue of land for the poor is finally addressed. He will end up paying the ultimate price for his defiance of the Roman Senate and the patrician class. He will end up being savagely beaten to death. And this won't be a private, quiet form of brutal execution. It will be done publicly. In fact, there will be Roman politicians, patrician politicians, who will do this out in the open and beat him for all to see, so that they send a clear message. If you want to follow in Tiberius' footsteps, if you want to still complain about a lack of land for the poor, you can expect a similar fate. Despite this ominous warning, Tiberius' brother Gaius Gracchus will do just that. He will follow in his brother's footsteps. This is too important of an issue for him to just roll over and play dead on. He will, in fact, Gaius will make noise about further reform, and not only land redistribution for the poor, but he wants to clean up the corrupt tax collection process in the provinces. The Romans love to appoint their own as Roman governors in these distant provinces, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Rome. These were men that were not interested in the local populations. They were interested in lining their own pockets with money. So they would often overcharge the local population for their yearly taxes, send what Rome demanded back to Rome, and then pocket the difference. People are not stupid. They figure this out. So the tax collection system in the provinces was deeply broken, and Gaius begins arguing that something needed to change. He will also begin arguing that in times of bad harvest years, it rains too much, it doesn't rain enough, that the wheat harvest from which people took the wheat and baked bread, that was the staple of the poor people's diets, they don't have this because the wheat prices are skyrocketing in bad harvest years. Gaius begins arguing that in those years, rather than seeing people starve to death, that the city of Rome should step in, purchase the grain for them, and provide free grain to the poor in times of need. You can imagine what's going to happen to Tiberius for standing up to the wealthier classes. He will also be targeted for elimination. In fact, what we're going to see is the Roman Senate will pass what becomes known as the final decree in 121 BCE. And if that sounds ominous, good, because that's what it's going to mean for Roman politics. The final decree of 121 BCE will now grant the office of consul, the position of consul, two new powers that it has never enjoyed up until this point. And what the Senate is hoping to do is to expand the powers of the consul, and that the consuls will be able to target and eliminate supposed enemies of the state, like, as you might expect, Tiberius and later his brother Gaius Gracchus, who will be murdered along with 2,000 of his supporters. It will grant the power of the consul the ability to identify and eliminate enemies of the state, and will also allow consuls to declare martial law, in which there's a suspension of your natural rights under martial law. It is now a military-dominated government. So with these two new powers, the position of consul now becomes the most coveted political position in the late Roman Republic. Let me repeat that. The position of consul now becomes way more powerful than it had ever been. In fact, what we're going to see is sort of an unintended consequence of the Senate trying to crack down on all this dissent. They are now giving the position of consul more power than it ever has, and these consuls realize it. Remember how they only have a 1-year term limit? Not anymore. After the final decree, consuls decide, you know what, I kind of like being consul. Make me leave. Right? And if you start criticizing me for overstaying my welcome, I'll just declare martial law. Or perhaps I'll declare you an enemy of the state. This fundamentally changes the Roman Republic. The position of consul is now what people are killing to get into, and they are killing to stay in the position of consul. The Senate, in other words, has not realized the long-term ramifications of what they're doing by bolstering the power of consuls. So this permanently changes the dynamic in Roman politics. Everyone wants to be a consul now. They're overstaying their limits. They're killing. The number of political assassinations is going through the roof in the late Roman Republic. By 60 BCE, in fact, you have two wealthy men, Crassus and Pompey, who are ruling over Rome as consuls, and they've overstayed their welcome, as you might expect. They're comfortable in that position of power, and they're not about to leave it. But they will break with tradition even further by adding Gaius Julius Caesar to their rule. This becomes known as the First Triumvirate. in 60 BCE, where you have 3 men ruling as consul over Rome. Critics are up in arms. They call it the three-headed monster. It won't last all that long. In 53 BCE, Crassus will die in battle. And at that point, Pompey, it goes back to being 2 consuls, Pompey and Caesar at that point, but Pompey is back in Rome governing, while Julius Caesar, who is a wildly popular and successful general in the Roman army, he's not even in Rome most of the time. He's away on battle campaigns. Pompey begins to develop the notion that maybe he should rule completely by himself. Pompey begins pressuring Caesar to resign from his generalship in Gaul. He refuses, however, and Pompey then convinces the Senate to accuse him of treason and insubordination, even though Julius Caesar's been nothing but a faithful general and politician for years in Roman history. In 49 BCE, Caesar knows there's a problem developing in Rome, and that this problem will only get worse unless he takes action. He turns back to Rome with his men, his army, crosses the Rubicon, and triggers a civil war, which will last for the next 5 years until Pompey and his forces are defeated. This is when Julius Caesar begins to take power solely unto himself. He will initially appoint a co-ruler after Pompey in a nod to tradition, but 4 years later, in 44 BCE, he will announce himself as perpetual dictator of Rome. And the plebeians love him. They love him not just because he's a strong example of Roman manhood, he's a successful general, but they love him because he's going to implement several reforms that they had been clamoring for generations. Tell me if these sound familiar. He wants to offer free grain to the poor in times of need. He wants to offer land reform to his veterans to help out the poor. He wants to clean up the corrupt tax collection system in the provinces. He wants to enlarge the Senate. So through all of this, while the people love him, the Senate hates him. And in fact, the same year, he declares himself perpetual dictator for life. He will be assassinated. He will be stabbed 23 times by a group of conspirators, including his beloved friend Marcus Junius Brutus. What's so strange about all this, though, is it took a dictator to enact reforms to benefit the common man in ancient Rome. If the Senate thought they were going to turn back the clock, though, with killing Julius Caesar, they were sorely mistaken. So beloved was Caesar that many rallied to his cause and sought to hunt down his murderers. 2 of Caesar's faithful lieutenants, Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, refused to stop until they found who had betrayed their beloved general. They teamed up with Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, who was the great-nephew of Julius Caesar. They then spent several years rooting out and killing those who had conspired against Julius Caesar. Then they stopped getting along. They turned on one another. And in the end, the man that is left standing is the one with a family tie to Julius Caesar, his great-nephew, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or Octavian, who will become the first true emperor of Rome. This is the death of the Roman Republic and the shift to the Roman Empire. Culturally speaking, we will see individuals like Cicero living during this very chaotic time, worrying about the future of Roman politics. We remember Cicero for a couple of reasons. He was valuable in translating into Latin many of the key concepts of Greek philosophy. So he will use his knowledge of Greek as well as Latin to, update and keep alive information on a number of obscure Greek schools of philosophy, such as Epicureanism, Stoicism, and the academic skeptics like Socrates and Plato. Cicero also developed his own political philosophy and wrote extensively about the need for a return to virtue and honesty in politics. He's witnessed, the assassinations of Julius Caesar, the rising body count during this chaotic period, and he said people act like their leaders. If leaders are greedy, murderers, then that's how the people will act. Virgil will be another major voice emerging from Roman literature during this period. He will be a Roman poet who will author one of the most influential and long-lived epic poems in Roman history, the Aeneid, written over a period of 11 years at the end of his life. The Aeneid will be an epic tale of war, kind of along the lines of the Greek writer Homer in his masterpiece, the Odyssey. Much like Homer's work will inspire Greek nationalism, a shared sense of pride in their history, so too did Virgil's Aeneid inspire Roman nationalism. By celebrating Roman military conquest, Virgil's work would go on to influence generations of young Roman men who studied his poems in school. We'll talk more about Roman culture under the early empire in the next lecture.